guys have a good lunch? Okay, you remember what I told you this morning now. Don't try to figure out what he's doing, because if you do, you'll be sorry. If you try and follow somebody who goes on as many levels as fast as he does and knows as much as he does, don't be afraid to ask questions, too, because you can ask the weirdest ones and he'll know the answers. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, an author of some 30, what is it now, 6, 7?
33.
33. And a third. Anyway, Dr. Robert Anton Wilson, who wrote The Illuminati and gave me a book called Sex, Drugs, and Magic, so he's got to be one of us. Those are all things I believe of, especially the second one. Actually, they're all the same thing to me in some kind of way. But I want you to enjoy yourself and sit back and just let your mind be twisted into something better. And I'll see you guys later. Robert?
Well, thank you very much, especially the three who stood up and gave me a standing ovation. Wow, you think I was the Pope or something? Well, I am a Pope. I'm a Pope in the Discordian Society, but every member of the Discordian Society is a Pope, and we're all equally infallible, which means that all the popes in the Discordian Society have excommunicated all the other popes. Every Discordian pope has a congregation of one, namely himself or herself. But before I get into Discordian atheology and ametaphysics and so on, I would like to lead you all in a chant. Just repeat after me. There is only one God. There's only one God. He is the Sun God. He is the Sun God. Ra, ra, ra. Good, now you're ready to be cheerleaders for an Egyptian football team. Actually, July 23rd, well, this is July 23rd if you're not keeping track. July 23rd is a very important day in Egyptian, it's New Year's Day in Egypt. It has been New Year's Day in Egypt for several thousand years. On this day, July 23rd, from Egypt or from anywhere that far south, if you're looking at the southern sky at dawn, as the sun comes up, you see something very weird you don't see on any other day of the year. You see another bright light rising behind the sun. The Egyptians attached great importance to that mysterious white light that rises behind the sun on July 23rd. That white light is Sirius. And we've got a candidate for president this year named Are You Serious? And I'm having a hard time deciding the election. I don't know whether to vote for Are You Serious or for Steve Gaskin, because they both have equally good platforms. Free medical care for all, legalize marijuana, and everybody have a ball. That sounds to me like a platform I can get behind. Unfortunately, there are two candidates offering the same. So I don't know what I'm going to do about that. Meanwhile, most of the public is trying to decide between Bohr and Gush, whom I refer to as the two lying bastards. I have an appointment with a friend of mine during the first Bush, whatever their names are, Gush and Bohr, whoever they are. When they have their first debate, we're going to do acid and watch the debate on television. Well, I got this idea from Cary Grant. During his third divorce trial, his wife charged mental cruelty. Everybody who's seen Cary Grant on screen, the charming personality, the charisma, the wonderful humor, everything, you can't believe he could be guilty of mental cruelty, can you? Well, one of the counts of mental cruelty was that he would never go to the Academy Award dinners. And she kept, all through their marriage, she kept trying to force him to take her to the Academy Award dinners by buying the most expensive, sexy, and outstanding gown she could find to shock the hell out of all the other rich women at the Academy Award dinners who also bought very expensive, sexy gowns to impress one another. She wanted to out-impress all of them, and Cary just wouldn't go. He didn't like the Academy Award dinners. He didn't like going live anyway. He liked, according to her testimony, he liked to watch them on television at home. First he would drop acid, then he would turn on the Academy Award dinner, and then he'd spend the rest of the night jumping up and down on the bed laughing. Which is how I intend to watch the Bush-Gore debate. Well, I don't know if I'll jump up and down on the bed, but I'll be certainly laughing. All my life, as far back as I can remember, we've had a choice every election. The two major candidates are two lying bastards. And so it's not unusual for me. This is the first election in American history where the whole public knows we got two lying bastards. Or anybody who doesn't know it has been out of touch with the major media and internet, too, for the last several months. We know that Bush is a coke freak, or a former coke freak. And when he quit coke, nobody knows for sure. Every time he's asked about it, he changes his story, depending on the latest testimony by eyewitnesses. Bush either quit cocaine 10 years ago, or 10 months ago, or 10 weeks ago, or maybe 10 minutes ago. Nobody is quite sure. If you listen to his speeches, you'll develop a very strong impression that he's still doing a couple of lines before he appears in front of the cameras every time. And then we got the other guy, Gore, whatever his name is, who keeps changing his story about when he stopped smoking pot. That was either 10 years ago, or 10 months ago, or 10 weeks, etc. So here we got two lying bastards who are both in favor of throwing poor people in jail for sharing their drug habits, but neither of them has volunteered to go to jail themselves. They seem to believe very firmly in the rule held uniformly through the ruling class of this country and the ruling classes of most countries, that laws are for the poor people. The rich people shouldn't have to obey them. The only time I ever shocked my wife, which was a pretty hard thing to do, was when DeLorean was arrested. Everybody remember DeLorean, the automaker? He was busted trying to sell a box of cocaine. I forget how many kilos it was. A great big box. They had him on videotape. There's this big box of cocaine in his lap, trying to sell it to a narcotics agent and bargaining over the price. We saw that video after his arrest, and my wife said, "Boy, he's going away for a long time." I said, "He's not going to serve a day." And she said, "You know, you've gotten too cynical. With this much evidence, no matter how rich he is, they're going to send him away for some time." You know, remember how long DeLorean served? 0 days, 0 hours, 0 minutes. When you got that much money, there's just no way you're ever going to get convicted. But getting back to Sirius rising behind the sun on July 23rd, July 23rd has special relevance for all of us, especially July 23rd, 1973. Can anybody here name the two important events that happened on July 23rd, 1973? What? That's right. That's one of them. Monica Lewinsky was born, which led to the first time in American history that a president was impeached for having a blowjob. Now, that is really... He wasn't convicted, but he was impeached. This is the first time that has gone on record in the United States that having a blowjob is an impeachable offense. Nowhere in the Constitution listing grounds for impeachment does it include blowjobs. Apparently, either the Founding Fathers never heard of blowjobs, or they thought this was a private matter that was no concern of the public or the courts. I used to be an atheist, but I had to give up because I had nothing to say during a blowjob. I mean, random chance. It just does not express the gravity of the situation, you know. So Clinton got impeached for a blowjob. That's one of the. And Monica Lewinsky was born on July 23rd, 1973. Does anybody else know the important historical event that happened on July 23rd, 1973? Nobody? You haven't read it? What? No. I am surrounded by people who haven't read Cosmic Trigger 1. I feel I ought to go hide behind the chair and get another audience or something. On July 23rd, 1973, I went crazy, or I started receiving telepathic messages from Sirius, whichever way you want to look at it. I've been looking at it both ways ever since, depending on my mood at the time. On July 23rd, 1973, I awoke from a dream with a luminous being with a long white beard, even longer than mine at present. A luminous being, an ancient wise sage, said to me, "Study the history of Sirius." I woke up and I wrote that in my dream diary right away. And I went to the library and started looking up Sirius, the library in the town I lived in. And I found to my intense astonishment that July 23rd is the opening of the Egyptian New Year, because Sirius rises behind the sun on that day, which is followed by the flooding of the Nile, which means they're going to have good soil to plant their crops in. They began their planting of their crops right after the flooding of the Nile, and they always had good crops, which is why the Egyptian civilization lasted so long. And the signal for the whole thing was the rising of Sirius behind the sun. Now, according to Robert K.G. Temple, a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society in London, who wrote a book called The Sirius Mystery, there is more to it than that. According to Robert K.G. Temple, extraterrestrials from Sirius arrived on Earth around 4500 B.C. and made contact with ancient Sumerian civilization, which somehow or other got passed on to the Egyptians, which is the origin of a lot of their advanced scientific knowledge and their obsession with Sirius and beginning their New Year's on the day Sirius rises behind the sun. It was also passed on to an African tribe named the Dogon, who to this day claim that they were visited by extraterrestrials from Sirius. I see a few nodding heads, so a few of you have heard of Robert K.G. Temple and the Sirius mystery. Well, we will now make a leap across time and space and totally bezonk and befuddle our minds by considering the Church of Mary Magdalene in southern France. This is in a little town called Rennes-le-Château, and the Church of Mary Magdalene was built by a priest named Bernier-Saunier, Father Bernier-Saunier, who a few years before he built this church Rennes-le-Château is a very small town, so the Vatican doesn't spend much money on the parish priest. There's one priest for the whole parish, no assistants, no associates, and he gets a very low salary from the Vatican to maintain everything. He was so poor that he used to bum meals from his parishioners when he didn't have enough money to eat. Suddenly he came into a possession of an enormous amount of wealth, which he used to build the Church of Mary Magdalene, several other churches, a bridge, and various other public works for the town. He became the greatest benefactor in the town. This led to a great deal of mystery at the time, this was in the 1890s, over 100 years ago. This led to so much speculation and mystery that the speculation still goes on and gets weirder every year. Where did this humble parish priest get all that money from? Well, some say he found a treasure. Others say, Bagent, Lincoln, and Lee, who are three BBC producers who did a documentary about the Church of Mary Magdalene and later wrote two books about it, as a matter of fact. They claim to have found bank records that prove that he received, I forget how much, an enormous sum of money from the von Habsburg family. Now, who are the von Habsburgs? Well, they were the hereditary rulers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was one of the biggest empires in Europe. It was because of von Habsburg got shot in Sarajevo in 1914 that World War I came about, or at least that was the excuse for the war. The Emperor Joseph von Habsburg in the 18th century, in 1790, was the subject of a composition called the Emperor Joseph Cantata, which was commissioned by the Bavarian Illuminati. How many people here have heard of the Bavarian Illuminati? Oh, good. We do have a certain rapport here. Well, the Bavarian Illuminati hired an unknown composer in Bonn, Germany, to write a cantata praising the Emperor Joseph. And it's called the Emperor Joseph Cantata, and it praises him, among other things, as a bringer of light and a foe of darkness. Now, I have studied the career of the Emperor Joseph very closely. By the way, the composer's name was Ludwig van Beethoven. That was his first major composition. Later he moved to Vienna. Most people think of Beethoven as Viennese, but actually he was born in Germany. As somebody in Switzerland told me, the Austrians all claim Beethoven is Austrian, even though he was born in Germany. And they all claim Hitler was German, even though he was born in Austria. Well, if I was Austrian, I'd take the same attitude myself, I suppose. Anyway, Emperor Joseph, besides being a liberal monarch by the standards of the time, the major thing he did that probably pleased the Illuminati, he closed all the Catholic schools in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and replaced them with secular public schools, which really pissed off the Vatican no end. They always hate it when that happens. So I guess that's why the Illuminati considered him a bringer of light and a foe of darkness. The von Habsburgs have a traditional title. The eldest male of the von Habsburg family always has the title King of Jerusalem. This goes not only Emperor of Austro-Hungary when Austro-Hungary was an empire, and not only Emperor of Austro-Hungary, but King of Jerusalem. This goes back to the Crusades, and all the theories about how the von Habsburgs got that title all contradict one another. Nobody's quite sure how they got that title, but here they are. They're running one of the biggest empires in Europe, and they're also officially the King of Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem at that time was an Arab land. Then it became a Jewish land. Now it's Jewish and Arab both, since the peace accords. But according to the von Habsburgs, they are the Orthodox kings of Jerusalem according to somebody's authority. Whose authority? I don't know. Why did they give all this money to this humble parish priest? And why did he spend it all on public works? Well, let's look at the Church of Mary Magdalene, where we started. The Church of Mary Magdalene has a lot of interesting features about it. It looks like an ordinary Catholic church. It serves as an ordinary Catholic church. Roman Catholics in that part of France, in that little town, go to the church regularly. And yet over the door it says, the priest, Father Saunier, and had this put there as part of his design for the church. Over the door it says, "This place is cursed." Have you ever been in a Catholic church that says over the door, "This place is cursed"? Have you ever been in a Protestant church have you ever been in a synagogue that says this place is cursed? Why did he do that? That's just one of the mysteries, besides where he got all the money. Another mystery is when you get inside, the Stations of the Cross are just a little bit odd. The oddest one shows between the crucifixion and the resurrection. They've renumbered this. There are 14 Stations of the Cross in every Catholic church. They've renumbered them. The Father Saunier renumbered them slightly so you could fit in an extra one. In the middle of the night, there are these characters carrying Christ's body out of the tomb in a very furtive way. It sort of suggests the ancient. Some people think it's a modern heresy, but it's found in the ancient world too, that the resurrection was faked. Jesus was given a narcotic which simulated death. His friends took him out of the tomb. He recovered and went off to preach in India. That's one version. Another version has him getting as far as Japan. As a matter of fact, there's a place in Japan they will happily show you, which is supposed to be the place where Jesus is buried. And they claim that's who's buried there. And since all there is, nobody's got permission to dig, but if they did, all they'd find is a bunch of bones. And there's no way of testing bones for Christness, whatever that is. So we don't know who's buried there. But this is contradicted by early editions of Tacitus, the great Roman historian, who claims that Jesus, the Nazarene reformer, moved to Rome and was leading riots in what we call the year 90 A.D. So he either rose from the dead, or he faked his resurrection with a narcotic and went off to preach in India, or he went to Japan, or he was leading riots in Rome, or at least there's more than one version of what happened to the late Redeemer of biblical fame, our blessed Lord, or somebody's blessed Lord, anyway. What's even stranger, one of the Stations of the Cross shows a Scotchman in kilts. Here we got all these ancient Hebrews dressed like ancient Hebrews, with a few Roman centurions, and in the crowd there's a Scotchman in kilts watching with a very amused expression. What the hell is a Scotchman in kilts doing at the crucifixion of Christ? I've never figured that one out, although in my research I did finally find a book on the Christian origin of Freemasonry, which claims that Jesus was a Freemason and passed the traditions on to a few of the inner circle. Not to all of it. Even in the Orthodox Gospels, there's a place where Jesus says that some of the teachings are for all and some are only for the inner circle, which makes you wonder what they didn't write down, what the teachings were for the inner circle. Well, maybe the Scotchman was one of the inner circle, and this proves that Jesus founded the Scotch Rite of Freemasonry. Well, I don't know. That makes as much sense as why is a Scotchman with kilts there? Well, while we're pondering that, we move north to Stenay, which is a town near Paris, which has another interesting, the church isn't interesting in itself. Stenay is. Stenay has a coat of arms like every town had in the medieval world. The coat of arms of Stenay is the head of the devil. Now, neo-pagans would say it's the head of a horned god, and it could be Pan or Dionysus or any of the ancient fertility gods. But it looks more like the conventional Christian picture of the devil than it looks like any other horned god. Why would a medieval city in a Christian era put the head of the devil on their coat of arms? Well, this is the topic of a book called La Race Fabuleuse. Pardon my French. Most people, when they say pardon my French, it's because they've said one of the 7 unspeakable words. I say pardon my French because I know my pronunciation is lousy. Anyway, La Race Fabuleuse, that's a rough approximation of it means the fabulous race. This book asks why Stenay has the head of the devil on its coat of arms, and why the church in Stenay is so arranged that if you stand at the altar and look through the front door on July 23rd, you'll see the sun rising behind Sirius. You'll see you'll see Sirius rising behind the sun. And Gerard de Sade asks, why do they build the church that way, in keeping with ancient Egyptian traditions? Well, it is rather mysterious, isn't it? Well, after a lot of mystification and hinting, French occult writers don't like to ever tell you anything directly. They like to hint and hint and hint and sort of leave you up in the air in the end. Well, de Sade does a lot of hinting that he leaves up in the air, but he does give you a slam-bang conclusion anyway. It seems that the last Merovingian king, the Merovingians are a dynasty that ruled for a couple of centuries in the dark ages, between around 500 in the Christian era and 800 in the Christian era, more or less. The last king of the Merovingian line, Dagobert II, is a very weird character. In the first place, as soon as he was crowned king, he moved to Ireland. Now, Ireland was not a possession of France at that time. There's no reason why he should move his headquarters to Ireland, and there's no account of what he did while he was in Ireland. But he seems to have spent most of his years as king in Ireland doing God knows what, or the devil knows what. Then he came back to France, resumed his role as king, and was murdered almost immediately. He was murdered in the Ardennes forest on December 23rd, and I forget the year. I'm sorry, my memory isn't always perfect. But it was around 673, let's say, or 773. Well, anyway, around that time. Now, why did he spend most of his life in Ireland? Why was he murdered as soon as he came back, and who murdered him? Well, after examining a whole bunch of theories, de Sade comes to no conclusion, but he does seem to point an accusing finger at the Vatican if you follow all of his hints. he seems to be suggesting that Dagobert, after becoming king, went and hid in Ireland because it was so far away as time went in the Dark Ages that he thought the Vatican would never find him there. Then he thought he was safe, and he came back to France, and the Vatican killed him right away. De Sade does not say this explicitly. He just hints and hints and hints. Meanwhile, he discovered a mysterious Marquis de Bay. That's the B period. He's not giving you the full name of this informant because, well, you know, this kind of book, you never give the full names of your informants. If you gave the full names of your informants, other scholars could check your work and find out if you're quoting them accurately. If you don't give the full name, it makes the book more mysterious and more exciting and for the gullible, even more convincing. Anyway, the Marquis de Bay turned out to be descended from the Merovingians, like a lot of French royalty. And after helping De Sade a little bit with his researches and sending him on a lot of false trails, he finally did reveal the real truth, or what he claimed was the real truth, or what De Sade claims this mysterious Marquis claimed was the real truth. It seems that the Merovingians, unique among European royalty, were partly extraterrestrial. It seems that, according to Marquis de Bay, around 4500 BC, a scientific team from Sirius arrived in ancient Samaria. They later visited Israel. They intermarried with the tribe of Benjamin, who later disappeared from the Old Testament in a very mysterious way. The tribe of Benjamin, being then at this point made up half of humans and half of extraterrestrials from Sirius, moved to Greece and disappeared from record. According to the Marquis de Bay, they moved to France and became the progenitors of the Merovingian dynasty. So the Merovingians were half human and half extraterrestrial from Sirius. And all of their descendants today are part human and part extraterrestrial. And it turns out they all belong to very important royal families in Europe, but they're being tracked down and killed one by one by some mysterious enemy which doesn't want us to know about these extraterrestrials among us, or who just objects to having extraterrestrials among us. Again, De Sade does not become too explicit, but one has the feeling his evidence all points at the Vatican. So here we got a very mysterious book by a very mysterious character claiming that the last Merovingian king was murdered by the Vatican because he was descended from extraterrestrials. It gives one furiously to think and wave one's arms about, as the French say. Or at least it gives me furiously to think. Later, De Sade wrote another book, The Treasure of Rennes-le-Château, which deals with the priest I was talking about who came into an unexpected wealth and built the Church of Mary Magdalene and a lot of other churches and public buildings in Rennes-le-Château. According to De Sade, the way the priest got the money, he doesn't say anything about the von Habsburgs, the mysterious kings of Jerusalem, giving the money to... He says the priest found a treasure. And then he produces some documents which were passed down through several secret occult orders until they got to De Sade, which is the document the priest found in a hollow statue in a nearby church, not the Church of Mary Magdalene, a much older church that existed since way, way back in the dark ages. These mysterious documents represent 2 pages from the Gospel of Luke in Latin. But some of the letters are higher on the page than others. You know how police identify a typewriter by if the letters are high. Well, they used to before we all had computers. You know, sometimes letters are higher than others on a line. Well, if you take the letters that are higher than others, you get another message in French. Instead of the message of the gospel, you get a coded message in French. And this message says, to Dagobert and Sion belongs this treasure, and he is there buried. The horse of God by the noon blue apples. Now, I can see how Dagobert might be buried somewhere near there, since his historical records are unclear. Cyan is a bit unclear, but the noon blue apples really stump me. I've never seen blue apples, not even at noon, not even when I do mescaline. It's obvious that this message is intended to arouse curiosity rather than satisfy it. At this point, Bagent, Lincoln, and Lee, who I mentioned earlier, enter the story. But this is maybe getting a little, all this historical detail may be getting a little too tedious, so we will now do another chant. Repeat after me. Piss, shit, fuck, cunt. Motherfucker, cocksucker, tits. Very good, very good. Now this can never be played on the radio before. I just thought since we honored Monica Lewinsky for getting blowjobs introduced into American legal history as a grounds for impeachment, we might as well honor George Carlin. George Carlin did a comedy record which somebody at the Pacifica radio station in New York played around 10 in the evening, and the FCC prosecuted them on the grounds of obscenity. And the evidence of obscenity was that in the course of this record, is everybody here familiar with the works of George Carlin, more or less? I regard him as the greatest living philosopher. Carlin is the inventor of the big dick theory of American foreign policy. The big dick theory of American foreign policy goes like this. What? They've got bigger dicks than us. Bomb them! And if you examine American foreign policy over the last 50 years or so, you find that seems to be the major guiding principle. Of all the people who've argued for the legalization of prostitution, Carlin has given the clearest, shortest, and most unforgettable argument I've ever heard. Fucking is legal. Selling is legal. So why isn't selling fucking legal? Can anybody answer that? No, you can't. You see, Carlin really is one of our greatest philosophers. Well, in one of his routines, he happened to use those 7 words. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, motherfucker, cocksucker, and tits. And so somebody thought it was a very funny record, played it on the Pacific, WBAI, that's the Pacifica station in New York. And the FCC suspended their license, fined them, and raised all sorts of hell on the grounds of obscenity. They appealed, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of the United States, the 7 wisest men, no, there were no women on it then. There were 9 wise men, no wise women on the Supreme Court yet. They didn't make it until a couple of years later. The 9 wise men on the Supreme Court sat in solemn conclave, meditated deeply, consulted their law books, and decided that you could say fuck, cunt, piss, shit, motherfucker, cocksucker, and tits after midnight, but not before midnight. The last words of William S. Burroughs, the greatest American novelist of this century. I was going to add in my opinion, but you know it's my opinion, so that's rather superfluous. Other people have other favorite novelists. His last words were, "We must all face the facts that we are being ruled by people who are certifiably insane, or worse." Well, I was in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago speaking at a science fiction convention, and I found out that, like most science fiction conventions, are always held in luxury hotels. That's to persuade the writers that science fiction is really important, that the people who put on the conventions can afford to put us all in luxury hotels. So, of course, like all luxury hotels, my room came equipped with a bar. You know how luxury hotels, you have a little bar in the corner of the room, and it's stuffed with the usual vodka, gin, rum, brandy, whiskey, etc., beer, and so on. And I looked into it and decided I didn't want anything in there, but I did want a martini. So I called room service and said, "Could you send up a martini?" And they said, "I'm sorry, we can't do that anymore. The Georgia State Legislature has passed a rule. We can send food up to the rooms, but we can't send alcohol." So I said, "You mean to tell me I can get as drunk as a skunk on what's in my room bar, but I can't get a martini from downstairs?" They said, "Well, you can come down here and drink it, but we can't send it up." So I'm not much of a drinker, by the way, but if I wanted to get drunk as a skunk, I could have drank everything in the room's refrigerated bar, and I never would have appeared for any of my appearances at the convention. But I could not get them to send it up by room service because some legislator had a bright idea. There are three theories about the people who rule this country, which, to quote the philosopher Carlin again, one theory is that they're stupid. And that makes, most people tend to believe that. They sure act that way a lot of the time. As J.R. Bob Dobbs said, praise Bob. Praise Bob. Oh, good, we got some sub-genii here. That's good. That makes me feel like I'm among friends. As J.R. Bob Dobbs said, you all know how dumb the average guy is. Well, mathematically, by definition, half of them are even dumber than that. And it must be from that half that the Congress is selected, at least according to one theory. George Carlin heard me do that routine and asked me if he could build on it, and I said, sure, I'd be flattered. So Carlin added to his act a routine which starts out like that and then says, but the problem is they're not all stupid. Some of them are just full of shit. You can't tell whether they're stupid or full of shit without listening real closely because they both say the same things, but the stupid ones believe it. The ones who are full of shit just say it because they know it'll get votes from the stupid people. And then Carlin goes on, it gets even more complicated when you realize that some of them are neither stupid nor full of shit. They're just fucking crazy, as Burroughs said in his last words. So every time I look at a politician on television now, instead of being, I do a lot of dial surfing. At one time I thought I invented dial surfing. I called it Bavarian television. I do a lot of dials, and whenever I see a politician, I turn channels right away because I don't give a damn what those bastards are saying. What they're saying never has anything to do with never has any connection at all with what they do in the first place. And in the second place, it all sounds like total gibberish. It sounds like they're talking to a bunch of fundamentalists in a camp meeting in Tennessee. It doesn't address anybody with more than a half-inch of forehead. But now I stop and I listen to them for a while, and I try to decide, stupid, full of shit, or just plain fucking crazy. And sometimes it's very hard to tell, although with Dan Quayle it got easier and in the case of Dan Quayle, he was all three at the same time. I'm beginning to wonder about George Bush Jr. I sometimes think Clinton is going to be remembered as the interlude between Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein. I was at a libertarian convention in 1980, and like all libertarians, every time I go to a libertarian convention, I find myself a little bit ashamed of being a libertarian, which is to say I agree with most libertarian principles, but the way some libertarians present them is downright embarrassing. There was this one huckster who was selling all sorts of bumper stickers on the right to bear arms, most of which sounded distinctly bloodthirsty to me. And he was also selling buttons, one of which said, "Shoot Bush first." This being based on the idea that there are a lot of people who would like to shoot Ronald Reagan, and he wanted to encourage them to shoot Bush first because, like most libertarians, he thought Bush was much more intelligent and then therefore much more evil than Ronald Reagan. I imagine going around wearing a button saying "Shoot Bush first." I'd like to know who has the balls to do that. Who has the chutzpah to do a thing like that? I don't know how many of those buttons he sold. Well, anyway, look, I personally believe that Bohr is going to get elected instead of Bush. This is based on my Moe and Curly theory of American politics. For years, I have had an astounding record at predicting American elections. And since I don't claim to be psychic, I keep wondering, how do I do it? And I feel it's something I pick up from the audience at the debates and at the things I pick up from people in general. The way I think I have an ability to pick up vibes and body language and general moods and so on. But I try to get more specific. When Bush got ahead in the polls, and I still felt that Gore was going to win, what the hell? How do I do this? Why am I so sure? Now, if I turn out to be wrong, remember this. It shows you can't trust anybody just because he's sitting in a chair in front of you on a podium and supposed to be an authority. But I'm convinced Gore is going to win, and I finally figured out how I do it, how I predict the elections. Politicians, there's no Larrys in politics. They all fall into the class of either Curlys or Moes. And I assume you're all familiar with the classics. You all know Curly, Larry, and Moe, right? Yeah. Well, the American public, if you study a lot, they always vote for the one who resembles Moe rather than the one who resembles Curly. And if you look at George Bush gibbering like an idiot, which he does almost every time he gets, he's obviously the Curly type. Now, which is typical of Coke freaks anyway. They all gibber somewhat hysterically and incoherently. On the other hand, Al Gore, our pothead candidate, he's more the Moe type. There's something stern about Al Gore. I have it on good authority that he once studied neuro-linguistic programming. I don't know who he studied with it or where or when, but a guy from the Army intelligence told me that, and I tended to believe him. Gore studied neuro-linguistic programming, so he may know something about using words to manipulate and persuade, but he still looks like he needs Reiki in therapy. I mean, he's the most muscle-bound and uptight character in politics, but that does convey a Moe attitude of authority and danger. And most people in selecting a chief executive, what they look for is a mean motherfucker. They want a mean motherfucker because they figure he'll be meaner to our enemies than he'll be to us, which gets less and less convincing as it's harder and harder to find enemies anymore. But as H.L. Mencken said, the chief tactics of democratic politics are to convince the public there's a deadly danger threatening them, and then convince them that your opponent doesn't know how to deal with it, but you do. This involves the endless invention of deadly terrors threatening the public. For a long time we had the Soviet Union, and then that suddenly collapsed, and the biggest nonviolent revolution in human history. There's never been an event like that in human history where a tyranny that huge, that sprawling, from East Berlin to Vladivostok, it all fell apart in a couple of weeks, and it all happened nonviolently. An astonishing event, which I will return to tomorrow as part of my discussion of the acceleration of information and technology. But today I'm just loosening you up and seeing how much I can stretch your minds with tall tales and improbable yarns, most of which I think have some truth in them, although I'm not sure how much. So anyway, in spite of the polls, I'm convinced Gore is going to win because he acts more like Moe and George Bush acts more like Curly. By the way, have you seen the George Bush parody website on the internet? It's one of the funniest sites on the internet, gwbush.com. It sounds just like the regular George Bush website, except for a few oddities, like the Church of Mary Magdalene is like an ordinary Catholic church, except for a few oddities. One of the oddities on the parody website is the premature announcement of his running mate, which is Jesus. And the slogan is, a vote for Bush is a vote for Jesus. Now, Bush has been so angry at that website that he has declared publicly there should be limitations on freedom. And I think everybody in Washington agrees with that, but he's the only one dumb enough to say it with his bare face hanging out in public, which is why he's a Curly type and can't win. Now, as to the relative degree of stupidity, full of shitness, and fucking craziness among our politicians, the voters of California, along with the voters of 8 other states in the last 4 years or so, have voted to make medical marijuana available to people with various conditions for which it appears to be beneficial. California is one of those states. Hawaii is another, Arizona and New Mexico, Maine recently, and I forget the others. Now, according to the Constitution, all rights not enumerated in the Constitution to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people. I believe John Adams was responsible for that wording. The states or the people deliberately creates an ambiguity, because John Adams felt no matter how many limitations and balances of power we put into the Constitution, some people would always get more power than they should. So he wanted to hamstring the government every way he could think of. And so by reserving all not enumerated rights to the states or the people, that means either the state legislators or the people by initiative can overrule anything that the rest of the government is trying to do to them. This is one more attempt to decentralize and balance power. We do not want the kind of government that our ancestors rebelled against, where the king could just make the law by fiat. I feel this way. All red-headed women will report to my bedroom tomorrow morning. As Mel Brooks said, it's good to be king. But so all of these 8 to 10 states, I keep losing track. 2 of the states, the legislature overturned the vote of the people, but some of them are debatable. In the District of Columbia, the people overwhelmingly voted to legalize medical marijuana, and the city government refused to recognize the vote of the people. They were finally overruled in court. Meanwhile, we got the situation where if you have certain medical conditions, including the one I've got, post-polio syndrome, it depends on where you are whether you can use marijuana to relieve your pain or not. I happen to live in Santa Cruz County, which has the unique distinction of not only did the voters of California vote to allow medical marijuana for AIDS, cancer, glaucoma, and 4 or 5 other conditions, but the voters of Santa Cruz in a county-wide ballot voted 85% to legalize marijuana across the board, even if people just want to get high and have a good time. Imagine that, allowing people to get high and have a good time in this puritanical nation. How did that ever happen? Well, Santa Cruz is rather weird. So 85% of the people of Santa Cruz have voted to make it legal no matter what you're using it for, medical or non-medical. The district attorney announced the next day that he was not going to prosecute any marijuana cases anymore, and he gave his reasons. The doctrine of prosecutorial discretion holds that a prosecutor has the right and the duty to decide which cases to take into court. You can't take all cases into court because we don't have enough courts, we don't have enough citizens to sit on juries, we don't have enough time, etc. So the DA takes into court those cases he thinks he can win. That's acceptable practice. It's been part of English and American common law forever. Under prosecutorial discretion, the DA announced he won't prosecute marijuana cases anymore, since 85% of the prospective jurors believe there shouldn't be such laws. So what's the sense of bringing the cases to trial at all? So the sheriff announced the next day in all the newspapers that whatever the DA thought, he was going to go on busting people for marijuana. So the woman who grows the biggest marijuana crop in Santa Cruz County, which he distributes free to people with the medical conditions, she never charges a penny. It's all given away free. She has been busted repeatedly by the sheriff. He comes in, he swoops down, he cuts down all the marijuana plants, he brings her into jail, he locks her up overnight. In the morning, the district attorney announces he's not going to prosecute. They let her go, and she goes back and plants more marijuana plants and distributes more marijuana to sick people. The sheriff finally got voted out of office last year, and now she doesn't get busted at all anymore. Meanwhile, anybody traveling from Santa Cruz to anywhere else better not bring their medical marijuana with them, because Bill Clinton has announced, you think this is a democracy? Fuck you, I'll show you a democracy. And he's overruled the vote of the people of all these states. So we don't know whether we're living in a democracy or a czarist regime. We do have an official czar, you've all noticed that. His name is McCaffrey, Barry McCaffrey, and he's fully qualified to serve as czar because, as documented in the New Yorker issue from May 22nd, he's guilty of war crimes under the Nuremberg precedents. What more could you ask for in a czar than a proven war criminal? If Gore or Bush, the only way Gore or Bush could improve on this with the advances in biogenetics going on these days, if they dig up the bones of Ivan the Terrible, clone him, and then make him then we'd have a real czarist government. But in general, we've got a czarist government operating under the disguise of a constitutional democracy, which is why I am here without my medical marijuana and doing pretty good, all things considered. But that's because I'm taking heavy doses of ibuprofen, which I'm told is bad for my liver, but at least it's legal. Well, so it goes. How the hell did the government ever get into the business of regulating my medical care anyway? There's nowhere in the Constitution does it say, and the government shall establish a true and eternal body of medical knowledge, and everybody shall be compelled to obey this true and eternal body of medical knowledge, and anybody with opinions of their own will have their ass thrown in jail. There's nothing like that, remotely like that in the Constitution. The Constitution leaves it up to everybody to decide what kind of medical care they want. Them and their doctors, or without their doctors, they can decide on their own if they want to be really heroic or really stupid or whatever it takes to prescribe for yourself. But the Constitution doesn't give anybody any authority to control your medical care. Now we got a czar, and we got a whole mystique around the czar. You can't disobey the czar. If the voters vote against the czar, the president announces that doesn't count. The czar's opinion is all that counts. I think this began in 1945. In 1945, when Nazi Germany was collapsing, Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Soviet area, General Reinhard Gehlen, just out of curiosity, I hate to keep making you hold your hands up, but it's a tricky way of getting you under control. How many of you ever heard of Reinhard Gehlen? My God, about 3. He's one of the most important figures in the 20th century, and hardly any, well, that goes to show the advantages of remaining anonymous. Reinhard Gehlen was Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Soviet section, and he managed to penetrate the Red Army and the KGB because he made contact with a General Vlasov, who was a czarist, who was the head of a group of secret czarists after the Civil War of 1920-22, in which the czarists tried to overthrow the communists and restore czarism. They were allegedly all wiped out, but they weren't. Actually, some of them pretended to be communists and stayed there and worked their way into positions of power. General Vlasov was their major leader. He was a general in the Red Army. He had lots of other friends in the Red Army who were secret czarists, and they even infiltrated the KGB, which was supposed to be spying on everybody else to make sure there weren't any czarists or other non-communists, or worse yet, American agents sneaking in, or Nazi agents at that time. But running this whole show was a secret czarist named General Vlasov. Vlasov and Gehlen set up what became known as the Gehlen Apparat, which survived World War II and survives probably until today. When the American troops overran Germany, General Gehlen took several truckloads of highly confidential information, buried them at a secret location, and then drove to the nearest American general he could find and surrendered, announcing that he had all sorts of data about the Soviet Union and contacts in the Soviet Union that could be of great use to the American intelligence community. Within 1 week, he was out of his Nazi uniform and into an American general's uniform, and he was the chief American source of knowledge on the Soviet Union. When the CIA was formed in 1948, the Gehlen Apparat became their main European branch of their Soviet penetration section. So most of what the presidents and Congress of the United States learned from the CIA all during the Cold War years came by way of czarist agents, by way of a Nazi officer and his former Nazi colleagues, which may explain why some of the views we had of Soviet Russia were rather extreme. But things are never as simple as they seem on the surface. It wasn't just that the czarists were... You see, having failed to restore Tsarism in Russia, they decided to establish Tsarism over here, which is why we've now got an official Tsar and armies, platoons, regiments of spies, snoops, informers, wiretaps, mail covers, and we've even got the piss police, which even George Orwell and Franz Kafka never thought of. But now, not even your bladder is private. There is no part of you into which the government cannot spy. They can wiretap your phones. They can plant bugs in your bedroom and listen to your sexual activities. Now they can look into your bladder and find out what you've been ingesting lately, except for LSD. How many of you know that? There is no chemical test for LSD yet. So if you want to have a great time next weekend and not worry about losing your job, skip all the marijuana and just move straight on to LSD. Of course, don't blame me if you have a bad trip. I'm just telling you how to avoid the piss police. I'm not telling you how to run your life. So thanks to General Galen and his skill as a negotiator, he was called the super spy of World War II, but that was because he had so many good contacts in the Russian and the Soviet Union. He was obviously a better negotiator than a spy even, because a lot of other top Nazis got positions with the CIA too, including Klaus Barbie in who was moved to South America and trained a lot of the death squads down there. Buckminster Fuller says CIA should really be translated as capitalism's invisible army. Well, I don't know. Well, Buckminster Fuller said a lot of weird things. Of course, he was the most brilliant scientific mind of the 20th century, but still he said weird things. He said the world was governed by four forces, which he abbreviated MMAO. That's Machiavelli, Mafia, Atoms, and Oil, which being translated out of the Buckminster Fullerese into ordinary English, that's the international banks, the mafia, and the energy cartels. And according to Fuller, every government in the world either has their support or is presently being bombed by some government that has their support. Take the United States, for example. If you want to go to my website, if you have your laptops with you, or wait till you get home, my website is rawilson.com. That's easy to remember, isn't it? rawilson.com. I have a list of corporations that have donated more than $500,000 to both Bohr and Gush. That is to say, this is a list of over 30 corporations, which is to say we got around $15 million here, which means for each candidate, which means that whoever gets elected, these corporations win the election. Whether it's Bohr or Gush, the corporations have them in their bag already by the donations they've given to them. Anyway, MMAO, which uses governments to keep us distracted from realizing who's really running the planet. MMAO, Fuller's abbreviation for that gang, brings us back by a by a vicus of recirculation to Hoth Castle and environs, or back to the Church of Mary Magdalene and the Habsburgs. Otto von Habsburg, the present scion of the family that apparently gave all this money to this mysterious priest to build this mysterious church, he happens to be a member of the Bilderbergers. The Bilderbergers are a group of rich white males who meet once a year, always at a different location, and the press never covers their meetings. Nobody has ever proven anything sinister about the Bilderbergers. I have been researching conspiracy theories for over 30 years now, closer to 40. I've never seen anybody prove that the Bilderbergers have ever done anything illegal. Of course, the real die-hard anti-Bilderberger conspiracy theorists will reply, that just shows how clever they are. They haven't gotten caught yet. Well, be that as it may, I happen to think that whether they've been convicted of any crimes or not, when a group gets together that's all white, all male, and all very, very fucking rich, they are not plotting how to do good for you and me. They are plotting how to do good for themselves. And if their interests happen to conflict with us, well, you know, that's social Darwinism. The losers lose and the fittest survive. So I'm a bit suspicious of the Bilderbergers without accusing them of any crime. But Otto von Habsburg is not only a Bilderberger, he's a member of the Knights of Malta. Who? The Knights of Malta. You've all seen the Maltese Falcon. You can't possibly have existed this long without seeing the Maltese. There are people here who never saw the Maltese Falcon. Well, okay, fuck the Maltese Falcon. The Knights of Malta are a medieval chivalric order of which the von Habsburgs have all been members. And so the current Otto von Habsburg is a Knight of Malta. Now, there's a whole school of conspiracy theory, chiefly by Protestant and rationalist historians, which holds that the Knights of Malta are a secret espionage group run by the Vatican. They're all Catholic lay people. they're no longer all knights. They now admit dames too. If anybody here remembers Clare Booth Luce, she was the first woman admitted to the Knights of Malta. They have several other prominent rich Catholic women. To get into the Knights of Malta, you got to be Catholic and rich. You don't have to be male anymore. According to a book called Pontiff by two English journalists, the Knights of Malta serve as couriers between the Vatican and the CIA on matters of interest to both parties, which mostly concerns making sure that the people in Latin America remain barefoot, illiterate, and submissive to the United States corporations, or European corporations in some cases. Anyway, Otto von Habsburg is also the president of the Committee for the United States of Europe, and they have been working tirelessly since 1945 to unify all Europe, and they're getting closer and closer to it. There's a euro currency, a European Parliament, and step by step the United States of Europe seems to be emerging. So the von Habsburgs have an interesting history connected with Beethoven, the Illuminati, European unification, and alleged Catholic conspiracies, and the Bilderbergers, no less. And they may have financed that weird church in Rennes-le-Château. At this point, we turn to Bagent, Lincoln, and Lee, the three BBC producers I mentioned earlier. They did a show about the Church of Mary Magdalene, which led to so much interesting mail that they decided to investigate further, and they produced a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which became a bestseller in both England and the United States. I presume most of you have heard of it, whether you read it or not. It was a bestseller for quite a long time. Re-examining the evidence presented by Gerard de Sede that the Merovingians were descended from extraterrestrials, and that the priest found out about this, and for some reason the Merovingians paid him to build a church of Mary Magdalene, which contained this secret and code and the statues and artworks and so on. Investigating all this, Bagent, Lincoln, and Lee came up with a different and quite startling theory. Their theory is the Merovingians were not descended from Jews and extraterrestrials. They were descended from Jews and God, which is to say that the Merovingians are descended from Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. Now, in Orthodox Judaism, which was the only type of Judaism that existed in Jesus' time, you couldn't be a rabbi until you were married. They felt if you couldn't manage a wife and a family, holding them together and being a good husband and a good father, you had no authority to be a spiritual leader for the people. That makes sense to me, and it's one of the things about Judaism that I think is one of the most sensible, makes it one of the most sensible religions in the world. I don't trust religions with all male priesthoods. They tend to get caught molesting altar boys, among other things. And in the Bible accepted by the Vatican, which the Protestants, out of some kind of either stupidity, craziness, or full of shitness, or whatever, or some form of mental derangement, accepted as their Bible too. Even in that Bible, which is made up of a small selection of 20 to 50 Gospels that were circulating in the ancient Mediterranean in the 100 years after the alleged life of the alleged Redeemer, some people don't believe he ever existed at all. They believe he was a sun god like Osiris and Dionysus and a lot of the other dead and resurrected gods of the Mediterranean. But assuming he did exist, there were quite a few Gospels running around. The ones that got picked by the Catholic Church and picked up and adopted later by the Protestants, although they try to present him as a bachelor because of the Catholic idea that bachelors are somehow superior to married men, and we all know men are superior to women, right? Even in those Gospels, he's referred to as rabbi 3 times. Nobody could be a rabbi who wasn't married, so Jesus must have been married, even according to those Gospels. Some of the other Gospels make it quite clear that he and Mary Magdalene were, as Walter Winchell would say, an item. So they select Mary Magdalene as the wife of Jesus, and then they assume he had a son, and that Mary Magdalene and the son, fearing further persecution by the Romans or the Sanhedrin or somebody, fled to southern France, and the Merovingian dynasty is descended from them. So the reason the Vatican, if they're the ones that have been killing off Merovingians for the last 1,500 years or so, the reason the Vatican is trying to murder them off is so that nobody can find out that Jesus has living descendants. So now we got two theories. The Merovingians and a lot of the French aristocracy are half extraterrestrial, and the other theory is they're half divine, if we assume Jesus was divine and not just a historical character. Either way, it's quite an amazing theory, and it brings back to one of the classic archetypes, as Carl Jung called them. One of the classic archetypes is the empire is in disorder, the world is in chaos, an evil man is ruling everything. Then the true king returns and overthrows the usurpers. That is the theme of the Odyssey. It is the theme of dozens of fairy tales and legends. It is the theme of the Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. It appears over and over and over again. Well, apparently the Agent Lincoln and Lee claim this legend was planted to prepare us for the time when some descendant of Jesus will seize control of Europe and put everything to right and get rid of all the scoundrels who've been misruling that continent for the last couple of thousand years. Well, now we've got the answer at last, after all this mystification and wandering. Or is this just a load of bullshit that Agent Lincoln and Lee made up to create a bestseller? Well, meanwhile, other books have appeared about this. You see, in 1973, when Monica Lewinsky was born and I started receiving communications from Sirius, so I better explain. My communications from Sirius, I didn't take them literally because it started when I was on an LSD trip anyway. But the communications continued for quite a while. I had a psychic reading. I was at a psychic fair. And I couldn't resist the psychic reader because her name was Penny Looney. And I thought, anybody with a name like Penny Looney has got to be worth talking to. Well, she turned out to be quite bright, and she informed me that I was channeling an ancient Taoist sage from about 400 BC. So it wasn't an extraterrestrial from Sirius after all. It was an ancient Chinese alchemist. Well, okay, that may be the explanation after all. Then I made the mistake of consulting another psychic who told me I was channeling a medieval Irish bard named O'Loughlin, who lived around the 14th century. Well, my grandmother was an O'Loughlin, so maybe genetically I'm receiving resonances from an earlier O'Loughlin. I don't know. But about that time, I decided all these occult and mystical theories were getting too damn weird for my ordinary state of mind, which tends to be a little bit less romantic. So I decided to accept the modern scientific model, which is that under certain kinds of stress or strain, yoga, deep Reichian therapy, Jungian therapy, LSD, brain machines, various isolation tanks, you can break down the corpus callosum enough that the right brain and the left brain get into better communication. And all the information flowing in from the right brain to the usually overactive left brain seems to be coming from somewhere else. So I said, now that makes sense. That I can talk about in public without people looking at me like a nut. So whenever I address a scientific conference and deal with this subject at all, I explain how I learned to open the corpus callosum and let the right brain pour into the left brain, and that explains why I'm so fucking weird. But it has nothing to do with extraterrestrials or anything like that. Unfortunately, after I formed that theory, as a matter of fact, I still use that theory. It's my second most popular. It's one of my two favorite theories about the whole Sirius experience. I happened to look at a movie called Harvey on television, which I had seen many years before but completely forgotten. Now, Harvey is about a man who has an invisible companion who helps and guides him. The man is named Elwood P. Dowd, and he's played by James Stewart. Some of you must have seen this movie. His invisible companion is a 6-foot-tall white rabbit from County Kerry named Harvey. Well, I don't think they mention he's from County Kerry in the movie. But I lived in Ireland for 6 years, and County Kerry is where the Pooka is most widely active. He appears elsewhere in Ireland occasionally, but he spends most of his time hanging around County Kerry, especially at the time of the Pook Fair, which is a celebration in his honor that happens every August. The Pooka, or Pook, depending on the dialect, is an ancient Celtic vegetation spirit who is still honored by the Irish in spite of all the opposition of the Catholic clergy who keep trying to stomp this out. They haven't even been able to stomp out the orgies on Midsummer Night, so then you can't get rid of paganism in Ireland. All you can do is drive it underground. Anyway, the Pooka in the movie Harvey, there's a skeptic in the movie named Wilson, and since I'm very alert to synchronicities, I thought, Wilson, he represents me, so I'll see what happens to Wilson. Well, Wilson goes. Anyway, the Pooka in the movie Harvey, there's a skeptic in the movie named Wilson, and since I'm very alert to synchronicities, I thought, Wilson, he represents me, so I'll see what happens to Wilson. Well, Wilson goes through most of the movie denying the existence of Harvey and treating Elwood, Harvey's human friend, as a nut case. And finally, at one point, Wilson gets curious and he looks in the dictionary to find the definition of Pooka. And he reads the definition, which is a Celtic elf or vegetation spirit, wise but mischievous, fond of rum pots, crack pots, and how are you tonight, Mr. Wilson? Whereupon Wilson, on the TV screen, dropped the dictionary, and I fell back in my chair and said, now he's talking to me over the television. Which gave me a handy way of dealing with the whole experience of exploded or expanded consciousness. When I talk to scientific groups, I use the right brain, left brain model. When I'm talking to occult groups, I say it's a 6-foot-tall white rabbit from County Kerry. And I don't think I like the 6-foot-tall white rabbit from County Kerry because I don't think there's any chance, even in occult groups, that anybody's going to take that literally. They'll all know it's a metaphor, which is what this whole thing has been about, is recognizing metaphors and not confusing them with facts. Metaphors are very important, but facts are very important too, and we should learn to distinguish them. When I first arrived in Ireland, by the great law of synchronicity, created by Peter Carroll, a writer who's written several books on synchronicity, the great law is the synchronicity of synchronicity, which is that the more you pay attention to synchronicity, the more synchronicities happen to you, which is not unlike the law of fives and the Discordian Society, which holds that everything in the universe is directly or indirectly related to the number 5. For instance, take the number of the beast in Revelation, 666. That doesn't seem to relate to 5 at all, does it? If you add it together, 6 plus 6 plus 6 is 18, and 1 plus 8 is 9, and 9 is 3 squared, and there you got the 3 and the 2, which you add up to 5. So you see everything in the universe is directly or indirectly related to the number 5, given enough ingenuity on the part of the interpreter. When I first arrived in Ireland, my wife always brings a transistor radio so she can get find out the local news. She spoke almost every European language. She was a much more skillful linguist than I am, much more. She turned on the radio, which was in English. In Ireland, they've got to do a certain number of shows in Gaelic. This was part of the new constitution of 1922 when the Republic of Ireland got its independence from England. The only trouble is the Gaelic they use on Irish radio is the Gaelic recreated by William Butler Yeats, Douglas Hyde, and a group of poets and scholars in the 1890s, and it's classic Gaelic. And so this is the equivalent of doing the news in Chaucerian English. Nobody can understand it except scholars, but at least it's pure classic Gaelic. In those parts of Ireland where Gaelic still survives, it's 600 years more evolved, and it's the way I'm talking now, as distinguished from the way Chaucer wrote. So the Gaelic programs cannot be understood by the Gaelic speakers any more than they can be understood But at least it's classical, and that's what we want. God damn it, is more classicism, right? Well, anyway, this was in English, and the interviewer, who had what I later came to recognize as an educated upper-class Dublin accent, probably a Trinity College graduate, he was having this farmer from Kerry tell all sorts of stories about people he knew had experiences with the Pooka. Generally, the Pooka strikes at around 11:30. Irish pubs close at 11:30 by law. Most people are pushed out the door by 11:40 at the latest. Well, sometimes 11:50. But eventually they're all pushed out, the publican locks the door, and they all start home. The Irish roads, like the English roads, weave and weave because they weren't designed for cars. They were designed for people coming home from pubs. So people start home from the pub, and suddenly the Pooka jumps out from behind a tree and grabs one of them and says, "Got your arse, mate!" And then he drags this guy off into a parallel universe where he encounters Finn McCool and Cuchulainn and Niall of the Nine Hostages and all of the great Irish heroes of the past, and Shiva and Vishnu and all the Hindu divinities, and Osiris and Isis and Nuit, and Jesus and Mary Magdalene and Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, and all sorts of, and he has billions and billions, as Carl Sagan would say, billions and billions of years of incredible science fiction, Gaelic, Greek, Egyptian adventures right out of Finnegan's Wake. And when the Pooka is tired playing with him and finally lets him go, puts him back on the road, it's only about 30 seconds later in ordinary time, because the Pooka entirely controls time, which I will demonstrate tomorrow, by the way. Anyway, after a lot of these stories, the interviewer asked the farmer, "And do you yourself believe in the Pooka?" And the farmer said, "That I do not, and I doubt much that he believes in me either." And now I think it's time we take a short break. Everybody gets a chance to walk around, stretch their legs, except me. I get a chance to be wheeled around and have a cigarette. Okay. Where was I? Well, never mind where I was. I'll just descend by, I will descend by another declivity. That's an elegant phrase, isn't it? I got it from Ezra Pound. The Pei Due conspiracy in Italy, which has got a lot more publicity in Europe than it has in this country for some reason. In 1982, the president of Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, Roberto Calvi, was found hanging from a bridge in London, the Blackfriars Bridge, with his pockets full of bricks, where the rising tide had covered his dead body. You've heard of that? Yeah. A lot of people have heard of that. Good. So you won't think I'm making any of this up. In the coroner's inquest, it was ruled suicide. In spite of the fact that Calvi was hanging from the middle of the bridge, and to get to the middle of the bridge, he would have had to climb over the side and climb hand by hand from the rafters, the struts that support the bridge, to get to the middle, and then hanged himself. And he was 62, out of shape, and not given to athletic activities. There was an immediate series of exposés in the sensational press in England, even in the more orthodox press, over the fact that he was hanged where the rising tide covered his dead body, which is the threat that used to be in the first degree initiation into all Freemasonic orders. If I ever betray my brothers in the craft, may I be hanged where the rising tide will cover my dead body. It was claimed that Scotland Yard has been taken over by Freemasons in the last 100 years, and when they recognized the Freemasonic trappings, they figured it was a Freemasonic murder, and it was their duty as fellow Freemasons to cover it up. Whether that was true or not, it was widely charged. Meanwhile, in Italy, there was a whole series of investigations because Calvi was in England because he himself was fleeing investigation. He had been charged with several counts of stock and currency fraud with embezzlement of $55 million and with knowingly engaging in laundering money, drug money, for various groups, including the CIA, the Mafia, and an Arab terrorist group whose name I don't remember, which included Mehmet Ali Agha, the guy who later tried to shoot the Pope at Fatima. Mehmet Ali Agha, his story was that he was convinced the Catholic Church was behind Israel and behind all of the anti-Arab activities going on. Why the Catholic Church would be supporting Israel against the Arabs, I'm not quite sure. And it doesn't really matter, because after Mehmet Ali Agha was found guilty and sentenced, he changed his story and said he had made all that up. Actually, he was hired by the Bulgarian secret police to assassinate the Pope, which led to a second trial, which came to the verdict that Mehmet Ali Agha was such a goddamn liar that nobody knew what to believe of what he said. Meanwhile, the Pope went to Fatima, where a Catholic priest named Juan Crone tried to stab him to death and failed also. It seems this Pope has a charmed life. He survived 2 assassination attempts already. The priest who tried to stab him, Father Juan Crone, was a disciple of Archbishop Lefebvre. Archbishop Lefebvre split with the Vatican during the reign of John the 23rd. I'm sorry that number comes up again. July 23rd, Sirius rises behind the sun. July 23rd, Monica Lewinsky was born and made blowjobs part of the official history of the United States and grounds for impeachment. And July 23rd, the day she was born, I first began to experience altered states of consciousness of a very interesting variety, most of which have by now ceased because I got bored with them. I got more interested in mundane consciousness. However, my trip into fairyland or alternative reality or the world of the Pooka, or whatever you want to call it, was very educational, which is why I've been telling you about it, because, well, you know what the meta model means in NLP? Well, I will now define the meta model in my own way. See how close it is to your understanding or Richard's way of defining it. The meta model consists of all those statements which can be scientifically confirmed or disproven, or can be checked by ordinary experience. For instance, if I say there is coffee in this cup with some milk in it, and I test that it sure tastes like coffee with some milk in it. If it wasn't for the American neuroses about germs, I would invite you all to come up and take a sip and check for yourself. But if I say there is a woman in the front row with no shoes on, that can easily be checked. Anybody want to come up front and take a look? She's waving her feet around. Good, thank you very much, I appreciate it. That type of statements belong to the meta model. And according to Alfred Korzybski in Science and Sanity, we should try to restrict ourselves entirely to the meta model, the statements that can be proven or disproven by ordinary experience or by the type of extraordinary experience known as scientific investigation. Well, nobody has ever tried to really live up to that, not even most scientists. We spend a lot of our time in the Milton model. The Milton model consists of the class of all statements which change your consciousness in a beneficial way. Milton Erickson, known as the greatest hypnotist of the 20th century, or the miracle worker frequently, cured all sorts of diseases that doctors couldn't cure, and he did it by hypnosis. And he led to a vast rebirth of interest in hypnosis, which also led to Dr. Bandler studying Erickson's work and figuring out what techniques he used and how they could be generalized and used most beneficially. Of course, the dirty little secret that nobody wants to talk about is that if you understand the Milton model very well, you can make statements that instead of making people feel better, make them feel a lot worse. We don't want to talk about that, do we? But I mean, the class of all class of all statements in the Milton model includes both blessings and curses. As per example, in Ernest Lawrence Rossi's the Neurophysiology of Mind-Body Healing, Rossi was also a student of Erickson, by the way. In this book, he gives a lot of examples of the power of beliefs over the body. One example in particularly that's particularly memorable is a patient of Dr. Philip West back in the 1950s who was given cribiacin at a time when a lot of people thought cribiacin was a cure for cancer. This guy was at that time assumed to have about 2 weeks to live. His cancer had advanced to the stage when his whole family was prepared to see him leave any day, and we're going through the usual thing you go through at a time like that, which is pretty terrible. He was given cribiacin. He started to recover. He not only got out of bed, he started walking around the ward and cheering up the other patients and telling them, wait till you get your cribiacin, you'll all be doing as well as I am. This is very well documented. This case is very clear, very well documented, no bullshit. Unfortunately, someplace or other, this guy heard that other experiments with cribiacin weren't doing so well, and he began to have some doubts about it. Pretty soon he had his cancer back again, and he died, which is one terrific example of the power of beliefs over the body, which is not all. We tend to think of the mind as something separate from the body. I would like you to consider the mind as just a metaphysical term left over from the Dark Ages, which we can do without, and think in terms of the nervous system. The nervous system extends throughout the whole body, and everything that gets into the brain gets in by way of the nervous system. Everything that comes out of the brain comes out by way of the nervous system. It's neural connections between my brain and my tongue that allow me to say what I hope to say most of the time. Sometimes I say things I wasn't planning to say at all. That's known as a Freudian slip or having too many martinis at lunch. A terrifying example of the Milton model being misused is also in the book I just mentioned by Ernest Lawrence Rossi. He gives a case of an Australian tribesman who was killed by a death bone. A death bone is not something you hit somebody over the head with or stab them with. A death bone, you just point it at them. Pardon me, I didn't mean to point in your direction. I'll point it to her. I'm sorry. I don't have a death bone, and I'm not a qualified Australian shaman anyway. But if somebody who's fully qualified as a shaman and recognized as such by the tribe points a death bone at you, the overwhelming statistical odds are that you will die. This has been noted by anthropologists for well over 100 years. Rossi, in his book, gives one particular case that was very well investigated. This guy had a death bone pointed at him, and a group of European, educated Australian doctors of our tradition, of our scientific tradition, trained in the meta model, went to work with every type of psychotherapy, medicine, and curative thing they could to persuade this guy he didn't have to die. He died anyway, because the belief in the death bone was stronger than anything they could put in. They should have brought Richard over there. Richard probably would have saved him, but they didn't know about Richard, or that was too before Richard invented NLP, I forget. Anyway, the power, Mary Baker Eddy created Christian Science entirely on the basis of this type of use of the Milton model. I mean, the good type, healing people. She knew about the bad type. She called that mental malpractice. And since she believed sex was bad for your spiritual development, she got steadily more, what's the word I'm looking for? Steadily weirder as she got older, and discovered more and more mental malpractice going on around her. So in her 80s, she was spending most of her time doing spells to ward off the curses that were being laid on her, as she believed, by the medical profession, who objected to her taking their patients away and curing them. Then she decided the Catholic Church was out to get her too, and so she had to do even more spells against mental malpractice. I don't mean to make fun of Mrs. Eddy, because every week you can go to a Christian Science church in your neighborhood on Wednesday night if you're so inclined, And you will find people standing up and telling about diseases they were cured of by Christian Science. If you regard Christian Science not as a mystical revelation, as she did, but as a practical, rather lowbrow but effective form of neurolinguistic programming, nothing she did was really all that astonishing. If the nervous system extends throughout the whole body, we think with our whole body. And one way of illustrating, two ways of illustrating this that I have thought of recently. I've been lecturing on this long before I got involved with NLP. I was originally involved with general semantics, which deals entirely with the meta model. One way of illustrating the fact that we think with our whole body and not just with the frontal lobes as we generally imagine we're doing is the two little experiments. One works for both men and women, the other I think works better for men. The first exercise is remind yourself that you know the difference between the map and the territory. You have heard Richard use that phrase, the map and the territory. The map is not the territory. You have or you haven't? Good. So the words are not the things that you have not. Well, the map is not the territory means words are not things. Our mental images of things are not the things. Our ideas about things are not the things. There is an enormous gap between what our nervous system creates to understand the world and the world itself. We never know anything about the world, actually. We just know how well our nervous system is functioning. If our nervous system is functioning fairly well, our map of the world works most of the time, and we don't bang into doors that we didn't see, and we don't invest in tapioca mines in Nutley, New Jersey, and we don't become Scientologists. And when Bohr and Gush come on, we laugh our heads off instead of trying to decide which of these lying bastards do I want to trust. If our nervous system is not functioning very well, somebody can point a death bone at us and we might drop dead the very next minute out of sheer terror. Now to check how the nervous system affects the whole body, remind yourself, you know the difference between the map and the territory, you know the difference between your ideas and perceptions and the world that inspires them. And above all, you know the difference between a movie and real life. Everybody knows the difference between a movie and real life. This could lead to a long digression about Orson Welles, but I will resist the temptation. No, I won't. No, yes, I will. Now, after you're sure you know the difference between the map and the territory and our ideas and what's going on outside and movies in real life, go to see one of these modern catch-up epics known as slasher horror movies. I can't stand them. I saw once and I almost lost my cookies. So I decided to avoid them forever. I don't like that kind of movies. I like the old-fashioned horror movies, which are a matter of atmosphere and poetic camera work and suggestion, and the James Whale school of horror films, which influenced a lot of Orson Welles' work, by the way. James Whale was the first American director to use the techniques of the German Impressionists, and he created the type of film which is now the ordinary film, but it was entirely different than the studio film of the 30s, which was done as if you were watching a stage play, and the camera was about at the same level as the actors, and you were looking through the camera's eye at the actors doing a stage play. James Whale discovered that by setting the camera at different angles and moving it in strange ways, you created an atmosphere which nobody ever heard of before him. Whale did that magnificently in Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Old Dark House, and The Invisible Man, among other films. And he is the subject of a wonderful film about his last days called Gods and Monsters. Anybody ever see that? Yeah, I recommend it highly. Great movie. Well, he was a major influence on Orson Welles, who's been, in spite of being exiled from Hollywood and scorned and crucified practically, Orson is every modern film is more or less a James Whale, Orson Welles film. They use camera angles and framing the shot in ways to create an atmosphere. Well, anyway, after you know all that, and you know the difference between a movie and real life, go see one of these catch-up specials, one of these slasher horror, and see what happens to your body in the shock scenes. If you don't lose your cookies, or think you're going to lose your cookies, you'll at least feel physiological responses all over your body at the shock scenes. You may get up and walk out if you have my sensibilities, or you may endure to the very end. I think these movies are popular because they're great make-out movies for teenagers. Because if you're watching them at a drive-in, it's just natural to clutch the person next to you for support. And clutching easily leads to further exploration, as we all know. So after you've tried that experiment and found out your nervous system is all over your body and your whole body is evaluating everything, not just your brain, another exercise, which is much more effective for men, although I assume some women will react to it, and also remind yourself again, the difference between a movie and real life, and then go see a triple XXX hardcore porn movie and observe how your body reacts to that, even though you know it's only a movie. Then you begin to understand the basic principle of the organism as a whole. We do not think with our mind. Mind is a concept borrowed from the medieval theologians who, being bankrupt, cannot afford to loan anything to anybody. The nervous system makes a much better place to start when we're trying to understand ourselves and one another, which is why this particular science this workshop is about is called neuro-linguistic programming. It's about how language and the nervous system react to create the realities we experience. Now I will go into my digression about Orson Welles, which brings me to the muddle model. In the muddle model, which you had a lot of experience of in my first session earlier this afternoon, you find a variety of statements from a variety of sources, all of which seem to contradict common sense, all of which contradict one another, and all of which suggest some enormous mystery which maybe we can solve if we spend the next 20 years researching it. I regard myself as the world's greatest master of the muddle model, although I've had a lot of help from a lot of other conspiracy theorists. I am always embarrassed when I am described as a conspiracy theorist. I regard myself as a critic of conspiracy theorists, which is an entirely different matter than being a conspiracy theorist. What I do is examine their theories from the point of view of the meta model and the muddle and the Milton model and the muddle model, and decide which class they fall into. I do not endorse any of them totally, and I do not reject any of them totally, except for the ones that, well, I'll give you a couple of examples of conspiracy theories I do reject totally. There's a woman in Long Island who has an outfit called Our Lady of the Flowers, and she channels the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is an interesting concept. The Blessed Virgin Mary, it suggests somehow that virginity is superior to leading an ordinary life. Not only that, but in the Catholic ritual she's referred to as Blessed Mary, ever Virgin. She was not only virgin part of her life, she was virgin all of her life, even after the birth of Jesus. Now, how the hell did Jesus get out without piercing the hymen? Did he pass through like sunlight through a window pane? This has never been explained to my satisfaction. But anyway, this woman channels the Blessed Virgin Mary, and among the revelations she's gotten from the Blessed Virgin Mary, she's a disciple of Archbishop Lefebvre, by the way, the guy who has a disciple who tried to assassinate the Pope and who split with the Vatican during the reign of John the 23rd. And the Blessed Virgin has channeled, through this woman, has informed the whole Catholic world, which I hope doesn't include anybody in this room. Praise Bob. That the Vatican has been taken over by Freemasons and Satanists, which is why Father Kron tried to murder the Pope. He regards the Pope as the leader of the Freemasons and Satanists who've taken over the Vatican. This lady who channels the BVM, the Blessed Virgin Mary, in case you don't know the abbreviation, has also announced that Jesus invented AIDS. There's a lot of dispute about AIDS going on these days. The orthodox theory about HIV is under attack, There's about 2,000 doctors have signed a petition that the whole question needs to be re-examined because the heretics who think there's another cause have made a good enough case. Meanwhile, the official governmental United Nations, United States, etc., the powers that be have decreed the official theory is the true theory, and anybody who questions it is risking lives, which is to say that our theory is right, and if you question it, people are going to die. That's a good argument against allowing free scientific research and debate. And since there's a lot of money involved, some of them have gone further than that. Some have said the AIDS heretic should be imprisoned. That was in an English scientific journal. Somebody else suggested they should be shot. Now, with my particular condition, post-polio syndrome, there's also a loud debate going on about what causes it and how to treat it, but nobody has suggested anybody should be shot for having dissident theories. I can only conclude there's less money in post-polio syndrome than there is in AIDS. If there was as much money in post-polio syndrome, they'd be suggesting that the heretics should all be jailed or shot. Pardon me while I have another cup of coffee. I mean another sip. In 1938, I was 6 years old, and I must have been I had polio at the age of 4. So at the age of 6, I was already somewhat alienated from the rest of society because although I was walking normally again and acting normally, and I had been completely cured by witchcraft, I wasn't very good at athletics, so I spent more time reading books than I spent playing games. So I was already becoming the weirdo that sits before you now. And one of my weirdnesses was that I was in love with a radio show called the Mercury Theater on the Air, which was produced, directed, sometimes written, and frequently starring Orson Welles. It was a radio equivalent of the Mercury Theater, which was a theatrical group that Welles had managed throughout the 30s in New York. And on October 31st, 1938, Orson did one of his experimental approaches to radio drama. The reason I liked the Mercury Theater was that every week they did something different than they did before. They were always experimenting, always doing new things. This time the show, after a brief introduction which told you it was the Mercury Theater on the Air, and they were doing a dramatization of H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, which apparently most people were paying attention to something else and didn't hear. It began as a musical show, and suddenly that was interrupted by a news bulletin about explosions on Mars. And then there was more music, interrupted by an announcement that objects seen leaving Mars were now approaching Earth. Then there was more music, announced that one of them had crashed in New Jersey. And then they went to the scene in New Jersey, and the object that had crashed turned out not to be a meteor, but it began unwinding slowly like a manufactured craft. And after the top came off, something came out that was so horrible, all the announcer could do was scream and gibber incoherently, and then they were cut off the air. Then there were broadcasts from other parts of New Jersey about these creatures advancing across the landscape, building up to their attack on New York after they tore down the George Washington Bridge. And the last broadcast was by an announcer on top of the RCA building in New York, announcing he could see them approaching. And, my God, they're awful! And then he was cut off. And then you got a CB radio with a voice saying, "Is there anybody out there? Is there anybody out there? Am I all alone? Am I the only survivor?" At this point, the studio was full of policemen because so many people had panicked that the police wanted to find out what the hell was going on. They came to the studio. All the actors saw the policemen filing into the control booth. They all looked at Orson, who was directing, and Orson did this, which means hold it, don't nobody make a sound. And after, am I the only survivor? Was the longest minute in radio history. At that point, everybody who hadn't panicked went apeshit, got into their car, and tried to drive as far away from New Jersey as they could. So you see, the difference between movies, between drama and real life is not always that clear. And yet most of the time we can make the distinction fairly easily. And we never think of how mysterious it is. Imagine, I don't know why I like to use Laurence Olivier, you go into the theater a few years ago. He died, didn't he? Yeah, too bad. You go into the theater and Laurence Olivier comes out playing Hamlet. You know it's Laurence Olivier playing Hamlet. Within a few minutes you're suffering Hamlet's problems, you're involved in the play, and you forget that it's Laurence Olivier. What Orson Welles did was just exaggerate the effect of drama in general, which is to make you forget the fact that you're seeing a fictitious dramatization, something that is not real life. And it affects you just like real life. I've actually seen people weep at the climax of Hamlet when it's well done. I saw half the audience weep at the climax of Tennessee Williams' Orpheus Descending on Broadway. And of course I've heard people screaming like they were under attack by maniacs at various types of movies. So the distinction between the meta model, the Milton model, and the muddle model is very well to keep in mind, but quite frequently we lose track of it, and we might as well get used to the fact we're going to lose track of it. As, for example, Orson's last movie, F for Fake, which is now suddenly fashionable, and I sometimes wonder how much credit I deserve for that. I have been plugging that movie for about 10 years, and I've plugged it in several books and in magazine articles. I've plugged it every way I can. Now it's out on video. Everybody seems to be talking about it. At least all the movie buffs are talking about it. It's now considered one of Orson's greatest movies. When it first came out, it got good reviews, but it died at the box office. Now suddenly it's popular. Well, it's a new generation, of course. F for Fake claims to be a documentary about two fakers. The first faker was Elmire something or other, maybe. This guy did wonderful Van Goghs, Cézannes, Modiglianis, and a couple of Picassos, and a Van Duncan. He did some really great art forgeries, I think. He was arrested by the French for art forgery and served only 1 month in prison for mysterious reasons. He got out and sold his life story to an American writer named Clifford Irving, and the book was published under the title Fake, with a big exclamation point after it. And it told how Elmire had forged over 1,000 of the masterpieces of modern art that hang in museums all over the world. Since this was the confession of an acknowledged felon whose fakery had already been proven, it was taken seriously at first by most reviewers. Then the art critics started fighting back. They claimed Elmire was a talented forger, yes, but he hadn't forged that much. He couldn't fool them that often. Most of the paintings in museums which they had authenticated really were by Van Gogh and not by, all the Van Goghs in the museums were by Van Gogh and not by Elmire. The Van Duncans were by Van Duncan and not by Elmire. So then it came down to the question is, do we trust a convicted felon, or do we trust art critics whose reputation entirely depends on their reputation, their claim of infallibility? If he could fool them some of the time, could he fool them most of the time? How much of the time did he fool them? This controversy led to further problems when Clifford Irving himself came under suspicion. After selling the biography of Elmire, which made a lot of money and was a bestseller, he sold a biography of Howard Hughes on the basis of a contract which Howard Hughes had signed, guaranteeing that he would reveal all of his secrets to Clifford Irving and allow Clifford Irving to edit and write it in his own way. And it was signed by Howard Hughes. According to Clifford Irving, I wish I could keep a straight face at this part, and that's why I have never run for Congress. It has occurred, in this country, and almost in the whole civilized world, except for this country, medical care is absolutely guaranteed. In this country, medical care depends on how much money you have. And if you don't have enough money, there are only two groups who get free medical care: the known felons. That is to say, people in prison and people in Congress. They get free medical care. If you're not in prison or in Congress, you're stuck. Or you have a major illness, you're probably going to end up bankrupt before you recover from it. So I've been spending the last year or so deciding whether I want to go to Congress or to prison, because I don't want to go bankrupt, that's for sure. And I've decided that I can't get into Congress because I never learned to lie with a straight face. So I might as well aim for prison. So I go around saying fuck Clinton and fuck the Tsar, and I write nasty email to the president and my senators and so on. So far they haven't arrested me, but I'm working on it. But anyway, where was I before I got into that digression about Congress and president? Howard Hughes, yeah. Oh yeah, I was trying to tell this story with a straight face. Putnam believed it, one of the biggest publishers in New York. They gave Clifford Irving an advance of $1 million, which does not sound really great by 1990 standards, but by 1960 standards, it was probably the biggest advance a writer ever got. But Howard Hughes was a fascinating character. Howard Hughes had affairs with at least 1,000 of the most beautiful actresses in the world. That's a conservative estimate. At one point, he was having honest to God, this was on Biography a week or so ago, he was having affairs with 240 actresses at the same time. He had them stashed in different parts of the Los Angeles area, depending on, I mean, talk about satiriasis. Well, anyway, Howard Hughes was a great pioneer of aviation, a great pioneer of film style, a raving lunatic, and a multimillionaire. And in the 1950s, he got into a fight with David Rockefeller. David Rockefeller wanted to buy part of Trans World Airlines, which Hughes owned. Hughes did not want to sell it to Rockefeller. Rockefeller didn't want to sell any part of it. He wanted to maintain total control. So Rockefeller hired a lawyer named Sonnet, who filed suit against Howard Hughes for mismanaging the corporation and forcing this. David Rockefeller did own a little stock in Trans World. He wanted to own the whole damn thing. He wanted Hughes to sell the whole thing to him. He owned a little stock. Acting on behalf of David Rockefeller and other minority stockholders, they charged that Howard Hughes was so crazy that he couldn't manage the Trans World Airlines, and therefore it should be turned over to a receivership made up of David Rockefeller and 2 other Wall Street bankers. Hughes fought like a wildcat. I was looking for a livelier metaphor, but sometimes my brain caves in on me and I end up with a cliche. This does not happen in my writing, it only happens in my public speaking. Anyway, this case was fought through the courts for about 13 or 14 years, and Hughes lost at every level. Even though it was entirely unheard of for the stockholders in a company to sue the company itself, and there was no precedent for it in law, Hughes kept losing. He decided that Rockefeller had bribed all the judges in all the courts of the United States east of the Mississippi, and he tried to get the case moved west of the Mississippi. He also started buying all the politicians he could west of the Mississippi. He was buying up state legislatures by the carload, congressmen by the gross, and he gave $1 million to Nixon's brother, because giving it to Nixon might have attracted too much attention. By giving it to Nixon's brother Donald, he thought the world might not notice. By the time he got to the Supreme Court, Hughes actually won. William Douglas, Justice Douglas, writing for the majority, said that Rockefeller's suit was without merit and that Howard Hughes had the perfect right to run Trans World Airlines the way he wanted to. But by this point, Hughes was near bankruptcy from legal fees, and he ended up having to sell Trans World Airlines to Rockefeller afterward to avoid to losing all of his money. So he then retreated to one room in a hotel in Las Vegas, where he spent the rest of his life worrying about germs and conspiracies. The moral of this story, my friends, is don't fuck around with the Rockefellers. Nobody has ever been known to win a fight with the Rockefellers. Anyway, besides all of his sexual affairs, which of course nobody will admit having any prurient interest in, but it absolutely guaranteed a readership of around 20 million minimum, since Hughes had affairs with Jesus. Who didn't he have an affair with? Ava Gardner, Yvonne DiCarlo, Anyway, there were quite a few of them. Besides all that, there were all these details about his war with the Rockefellers, his great triumphs as an aviator. He set several speed records and long-distance records, and he survived 2 crashes, which many people think explain some of Howard Hughes' later behavior. They think he suffered brain damage in one of those crashes. I don't know. Maybe just fighting with the Rockefellers gets you into the state of mind where you start worrying about germs and conspiracies. Anyway, he met with Clifford Irving on a pyramid in Mexico, one of those famous Mexican pyramids. He had long hair hanging down to his waist, and both a beard to his waist and hair hanging down to his waist in the back, and his fingernails were so long they were like the claws of some ferocious beast. At least that's the way Clifford Irving told the story. It appears that at that time Howard Hughes was in his one room in his hotel in Las Vegas, and Clifford Irving had invented the whole tale. Meanwhile, he had $1 million advance and a chance to write a book about Howard Hughes out of his own imagination. Unfortunately, the publisher and all the media were notified that Howard Hughes was not coming out of his isolation, but he was going to make a statement. And over the phone, a voice claiming to be Howard Hughes announced that he hadn't met with Clifford Irving on a pyramid. He didn't have long hair and long fingernails. He didn't agree to having Clifford Irving write his biography. The whole thing was a fraud, which should have settled matters, except Clifford Irving came back with the claim that Hughes was dead and that this was an impersonator that somebody had hired to steal all of Hughes' money by pretending this guy was Howard Hughes. For a while, there were alternative Hughes theories wandering around in the sensational press for quite a long time. There was a lot of disagreement about where Howard Hughes died, when he died, what he died of. There's even a book called The Gemstone Files, which claims he was killed by what the hell is it? Aristotle Onassis. Aristotle Onassis was trying to take over the entire financial world of the West, and apparently he didn't feel any need to kill the Rockefellers off, but he did feel the need to kill Howard Hughes, so he had him kidnapped and murdered him on an island in Greece and had him buried in the bottom of the Mediterranean. At least that's according to the Gemstone File, which is allegedly written by an ex-CIA agent revealing all the secrets that have been hidden from the public all these years. Be that as it may, in F for Fake, Clifford Irving plays Clifford Irving, Elmire plays Elmire, Orson Welles plays Orson Welles, and the whole movie is presented as a documentary about 2 notorious fakers. Except at various points in the movie, Elmire and Clifford Irving disagree with various things that are generally accepted. For instance, Elmire still insists that there are 1,000 of his paintings hanging in museums identified as Van Gogh's, and that the art historians, art critics, art scholars, art experts who authenticated them go on authenticating them because to admit they made a mistake would lose all their credibility, and especially admitting they made 1,000 mistakes. And people would have no authorities to tell them what's a real Van Gogh and what's a fake Van Gogh, and then what could they do? All they'd have to do is start thinking for themselves. For Christ's sake, who would want to inflict that on the human race? Develop your own artistic taste, your own ability to judge, your own ideas about what's good art and bad art. We need the experts to tell us what we're supposed to like, right? You wouldn't want to try to judge. If I held up 2 Van Goghs and said, this is a Van Gogh and this is an Elmire, wouldn't you feel much happier than if I held 2 of them up and said, one is a Van Gogh and one is an Elmire, and left it up to you to decide which was which? We need the experts, otherwise we might have to rely on ourselves. Meanwhile, there's another delicate point comes up in the course of the movie in which Elmire points out that it is no crime to paint in another artist's style. All art students start out that way. If you're studying art, you learn to do Rembrandts and Da Vinci's and Hogarth's and Van Gogh's and Monet's and whatnot, and then you develop your own style gradually. But painting in somebody else's style can't be a crime. It's part of learning art. And Elmire said, actually, I never put the signatures on the paintings. That was 2 crooked art dealers in Paris who did that. And Orson asks, and who forged the Howard Hughes signature on the contract? And then you get 10 rapid shots of Elmire looking into the distance, and Clifford Irving looking every way except at the camera, and a clock ticking to convince you this is all happening in real time. And finally, Clifford Irving says, somebody signed the paintings. Now this seems to be the classic example of cinema verite, which was a school of film very popular in the 50s and 60s in Europe, where the whole aim is to get people to show their true selves by using documentary techniques, editing it properly, and not putting anything over on the audience. But as a matter of fact, that whole sequence was faked. What Orson Welles did was, I take out of a year of interviews, he took all the shots where Elmire and Clifford Irving were not talking, but were looking in some other direction or thinking about something else. He put them together, and the audience projects into the film what they imagine that Elmire and Clifford Irving are thinking. And just to prepare you for that, there's an earlier sequence in the film in which seems to be a digression, which Welles says is a study of the ancient art of girl watching. And then a fabulously rich Hungarian named Oya Kodor, in a very, very short miniskirt, walks down a street in Paris. And you get these close-ups of all these men's faces reacting to this beautiful woman in a miniskirt walking by. The fascinating thing about this sequence is you know it's happening in real time. It's cinema verite because you can hear her heels clicking all through the sequence as she walks down the street. Now, Orson Welles was both a magician as well as being an actor, director, producer, writer, etc. Stage magic was his passion from the age of about 8, and his movies are full of stage magic tricks. What Orson was doing was a conspiracy with a technician known as the sound mixer. Those men whose faces you see reacting to Oya Kodor, they weren't reacting to her at all, they were reacting to other things. But intercutting their faces with her swinging hips, you imagine they're reacting to her. So Orson was once again showing we can't tell the difference between a documentary and a work of fiction. The climax comes when we learn that Oya Kodor not only acted as go-between in the sales of some of Elmire's paintings, but that her grandfather was an even greater forger than Elmire and is responsible for not 1,000, but literally thousands of them, masterpieces of Renaissance art hanging in museums. And her grandfather actually appears on screen and confesses to it. And he says, I don't see any crime in it. I have added to the world some total of masterpieces. How can that be a crime? How can it be a crime to commit a masterpiece? At this point, all the scenery disappears and you see the extras, the technicians carrying the walls and whatnot away, and the whole bedroom disappears, everything disappears, and Orson is left alone with Oya Kodor. And she then admits she's not Hungarian, her grandfather was not an art forger, and so actually she was Yugoslavian, and she was Orson Welles' last wife. So at the end of the movie, you are left with the question, okay, we've seen, artistically, it makes perfect sense. What better way to present the story of a fake biography of a painting faker than to make the movie itself a bit of a fake? But it's so amusing, you can't resist the temptation to look at it again. And when you look at it again, you find yourself asking more and more, was this scene faked? Was this scene real? And Welles has thrown in some places where it's obviously fake just to keep you alert. Like there's one scene where they keep cutting back to Orson in an art gallery in Paris talking directly to the camera, intercut with Elmire in the Isle of Ibiza talking to Francois Reichenbach, the producer of the film, about his career. And at one point, Elmire, who was born Hungarian, he was a real Hungarian, unlike Oya Kodor. Elmire is saying something and he can't find the English word. He said, that would be, and in Paris, Orson says intrusive, and Elmire says intrusive. And it makes so much fun. We do that all the time when somebody can't find a word, we suggest a word for them. Except that Orson is in Paris and he's in Ibiza. How did he hear Orson all the way from Paris? This was accomplished by the miracle of editing. Elmire paused to look for a word, and Orson inserted a sequence of himself providing the word, and it looks like Elmire picked it up. Once you spot that, you can see the movie any number of times. I've seen it over 100 times by now, trying to figure out how many scenes are faked and how many are real. Now that I consider an even greater classic of the muddle model than any of my own works. Because no matter how many times you reread it, reread one of my books or re-see F for Fake, you're never quite sure which parts are faked and which parts are real. And what is the moral of that? The moral of that is the real world functions exactly that way. You never know what parts are real and what parts are faked. And the best way is to learn to get used to it and not think in terms of either or logic, like Aristotle taught a couple of thousand years of the Western world, to think in terms of it's either true or false, yes or no, 1 or 0. Following Alfred Korzybski, the man who said the map is not the territory and invented general semantics, I have sort of concretized one of Korzybski's ideas on a scale of 1 to 10. Instead, Korzybski just denounced either or logic and said we should learn to think beyond either or logic. But he explained this in rather technical mathematical language, and most people didn't understand him, so I've simplified it. Think in terms of 1 to 10. And then instead of reacting immediately to George Bush is still doing cocaine, let's say, there's an interesting statement. I swear to God, every time I see him on the news, he sounds like he's on coke. He's raving and ranting about the weirdest things. And he can't speak English. Maybe his father couldn't speak English either. Maybe it runs in the family. But let's take George Bush is still doing cocaine. He never quit. Instead of saying yes or no, put that on a scale of probabilities based on how much you actually know, how much you may have been misled by the major media and by the Bush campaign, etc., and give it a rating. Let's take something else. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I would give that a rating of 9. Most people would give it a rating of 10. I give it a rating of 9 because we got to get used to the idea we're not going to spend the rest of our lives on this planet, at least not all of us are. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit at ground level on the surface of this planet. I would give it 10. So far, I haven't heard of any exceptions to that. However, when you get up into the Himalayas, it doesn't work anymore. It's either higher or lower, I forget which. It's only at ground level that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. How about people from Sirius intermarried with the tribe of Benjamin in ancient Israel, and their descendants became the Merovingian kings of France, and many royal families around Europe are still descended from them. How many want to put that around 1? How many want to give it a rating of 3 or 4? How many want to give it a rating of 5? How many want to give it a rating of 7 or 8? My God, you see? We got votes for all of those alternatives. How about Roberto Calvi was killed by the Freemasons? Anybody want to give that? Well, let's just call out your numbers, but don't shout over each other. 1. Do I hear 2? Do I hear 3? 4? 5? 6? 7? 8? 8? We got an 8. You take 7. Actually, it appears that Roberto Calvi was killed by the mafia. In most of my books about the Pay Due conspiracy, I always left it an open question. But about 6 months ago, more or less, a mafia assassin who was facing life imprisonment in Italy decided to turn state's evidence and implicate a whole bunch of upper mafia dons and godfathers and capo di tutti capo, etc. And among the other crimes he confessed was strangling Roberto Calvi and hanging him from the bridge. Of course, he did not explain why he did this because he was only a soldier. And in the mafia, if you're told to kill somebody, you go and kill them. You don't stop and say why. That's rude. That's uncouth. That's implied. It's not part of the code of the brotherhood. If you stopped and asked why, you're obviously not a fit member, and the next thing you know, you're on the list that's going to be hit next. So we have no idea why he killed Roberto Calvi, but he says he did it, and he's implicated a lot of other mafia people. And probably the motive, a good guess as to the motive, was that Calvi shortchanged the mafia on one of the drug laundering deals. It appears, according to the evidence investigated by the Italian investigating magistrates, that Calvi was using his Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, the Vatican Bank in Rome, and a mysterious contraption called the Cisalpine Bank in the Bahamas, which Calvi co-owned with Archbishop Marcinkus, the manager of the Vatican Bank, and 200 of what the investigating magistrates call ghost banks. What they mean by ghost banks are banks that existed in Calvi's ledgers but could not be found on the surface of the planet Earth anywhere. They were virtual banks or imaginary banks. But by transferring money back and forth between these virtual banks and the Cisalpine Bank, which was a tiny bank in the Bahamas that hardly anybody paid any attention to, a great deal of drug money got laundered. This scheme was masterminded by a chap named Licio Gelli. And just to give you an idea how practical my multivalued logic is compared to the Aristotelian true-false logic, nobody has yet decided on which side Licio Gelli was in the Second World War. His later activities are even more puzzling. But during World War II, according to testimony that came out after the war, Gelli was working for the Gestapo in Italy, and he was also working for the Communist Underground, and both of them knew about it. The Gestapo knew he was working for the Communist Underground, and the Communist Underground knew he was working for the Gestapo, and he managed to convince both sides that he was actually serving their interest and betraying the other side. Although, as everybody knows, when you get into espionage games, the other side that you're betraying, you got to give them a certain amount of truth or they stop trusting you. So when the war was over, Gelli was threatened with trial as a war criminal for people he had turned over to the Gestapo. He did not stand trial as a war criminal because so many people came forth and said he had saved their lives by lying to the Gestapo. So which side was he? Well, apparently he was on the side that was going to win. He wanted to make sure he'd be on the side that would win by being on both sides until the conclusion. He was closely associated with General Reinhard Gehlen, who we mentioned earlier, apropos the Gehlen Apparat. The Gehlen Apparat and Gelli later managed a CIA project called Gladio. Gladio was a CIA project to control the elections in Italy. Italy in the 1940s and up to the present even, I think, but especially in the 40s and 50s, had the largest communist party in Europe. It also had more left-wing parties than almost any other, and every European nation has left-wing parties. I think the United States is the only country in the industrial world that doesn't have any left-wing parties. Well, we got left-wing parties, but usually they're not on the ballot, and if they are on the ballot, nobody gets to hear their speeches. And if anybody does get to hear their speeches, all they ever get from the major media is third parties never win. So that's the way they force us to choose between Bohr and Gush, or some other group of two lying bastards, as I call them. Anyway, as soon as Gladio was established, Gelli was put in charge of it by the CIA. He was working out of the American Embassy in Rome, and it seems one of the very first things he did after getting on the CIA payroll was to go over to the Russian Embassy, meet the KGB, and get on their payroll, too. After all, if he was on both sides in World War II, he could be on both sides in the Cold War, too. So he was being paid by the CIA to control Italian politics, by the KGB to tell him all the CIA secrets he could learn. And meanwhile, he was laundering drug money for the mafia and apparently for the CIA, too, through a bank in Florida called the World Finance Corporation, which was indicted in the 1980s by the district attorney of Dade County for knowingly engaging in cocaine money laundering. There's a difference between engaging in drug laundering and knowingly engaging, because by now the law enforcement officials, in spite of their tendency to paranoia and general wackiness, they've all come to the conclusion that every bank is involved in cocaine laundering. So the only way you can really find them guilty is to prove they know that they're engaged in it. This came about due to a number of cases, of which the most famous occurred in New York, in which the DEA busted a guy they considered a major cocaine dealer, and they found no cocaine in his apartment at all. Not wanting to give up that easily, they seized all of his money under the asset forfeiture law, and they had all of his money analyzed. Most of his money was in $100 bills. They had the $100 bills, and all the $100 bills showed traces of cocaine. So they brought him to trial on the grounds of being a major cocaine dealer, as proved by the fact that every $100 bill in his house had cocaine traces on it. The defense brought to the stand a private detective whom they had hired, and what this private detective had done was go to the 10 largest banks in New York with a $1,000 bill for each bank given to him by the defense attorney, and he asked for 10 ones in return. So he got 10 $100 bills from the 10 largest banks in New York, which comes to 1,000 $100 bills. They took them all to a laboratory and had them analyzed, and every one of them showed traces of cocaine. So every time you touch a $100 bill, you're getting a little bit of cocaine on your fingers. They're very useful for payoffs, and they also make nice sniffers. And so engaging in laundering cocaine money is no longer considered a crime. They got to prove you were knowingly engaged in it. The DA of Dade County thought he could prove the Royal Finance Corporation was knowingly engaged in it, and he collected a great deal of evidence that they were getting a lot of money by way of the CIA from the Contras and various other groups that the CIA was supporting in Latin America to oppose various revolutionary groups. And this money was, there was a ranch in Costa Rica that belonged to a guy named John Hull. And at this ranch, evidently, cocaine was exchanged for guns under CIA supervision. The Contras and other groups that the United States, or the CIA at least, wanted to support would bring in their cocaine, and the CIA would give them guns to go back and shoot the people they didn't like, who were mostly people who didn't want to remain barefoot, raggedy, and illiterate and wanted a better chance at life. And so Costa Rica tried to indict John Hull, and he fled back to the United States. The United States refused to extradite him. The CIA then the Costa Rican government then tried to indict Oliver North on the grounds that he was the one in charge of the whole guns for cocaine operation down there. And Oliver North refused to come to Costa Rica to stand trial, and the United States refused to extradite him too. Although he did admit under congressional questioning that he had spent many, many nights after receiving his indictment using the shredding machine to destroy evidence of all of his activities for the previous 10 years. But he said that was in the interest of national security. Now, if Clinton had only thought of that, Monica Lewinsky's dress never would have got admitted as evidence. National security, that's a great excuse to cover up anything you want to cover up, you know. Anyway, the Royal Finance Corporation turned out to have 8 officers who were former CIA employees. Now, former CIA employees has 2 meanings. In popular understanding, as guided by the mass media, which is run by millionaires who sincerely want to educate us and tell us the truth about everything and never want to lie to us about anything or gull us or con us or hide their own crimes. According to that version of reality, a former CIA agent is somebody who's retired from the agency and isn't engaged in their business anymore. According to a bunch of paranoid right-wingers and left-wingers and other nuts, a former CIA agent is somebody who's still working for the agency, but engaged in what they call black ops, which are the kind of projects they don't want the public to ever find out about. But if the public ever does find out about it, it will turn out, well, they weren't working for the CIA anymore. They quit 5 years ago. So you can take your choice about the 8 officers of the World Finance Corporation. They were either former CIA agents or they were still CIA agents being paid through numbered bank accounts in Switzerland, which is the usual operation. Anyway, after going through the World Finance Corporation in Miami, the cocaine money went to the Cisalpine Bank in the Bahamas, run by Archbishop Marcinkus and Roberto Calvi, whereupon it disappeared somewhere between the Vatican Bank, the Banco Ambrosiano, and the 200 virtual banks that Calvi had collected. No, the Vatican Bank is the financial equivalent of a black hole. You all know that anything that goes into a black hole never comes out again. Anything that goes into the Vatican Bank never comes out again. In spite of all the pay doué scandals in which 950 government officials had to resign, many were convicted and were put in prison. In spite of all that, none of the Italian bank examiners could examine the books of the Vatican Bank because it's not on Italian soil. The Vatican is a separate and sovereign state, and nobody can check their books except their own officials. So nobody knows where most of the money disappeared to, but the estimates are that the cocaine trade runs into hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Now you know why the Pope wears those gorgeous dresses and those and the pearl rosaries and all that. He came out on the balcony a couple of weeks ago with all of this fancy drag on and denounced a gay pride parade, which I think is the funniest thing since Al Gore announced we don't have enough data to determine if marijuana is helpful in curing any of the diseases it's currently used for and has been used for the last 4,000 years at least in most of the world. The way the Pope is selected is a deep, dark mystery. Nobody knows about it except the Council of Cardinals. Most Catholics, nobody knows it, only the Council of Cardinals. The way the Pope is selected is a deep, dark mystery. Nobody knows about it except the Council of Cardinals. Most Catholics, nobody knows it, only the Council of Cardinals. When a Pope dies, the Council of Cardinals goes into solemn conclave. The doors are locked, the windows are shuttered. Nobody knows what goes on in there. It's never been solved. I think I have found the solution, and this will put you firmly back in the muddled model again and help you to realize the value of non-Aristotelian logic and not jumping to conclusions. Every church in the Western world has ordained a woman by now. There are women rabbis, there are women in the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, most of the Lutherans except the Missouri Synod. The Catholic Church alone remains adamant. Women cannot become priests. And the Pope has explained quite clearly why. A priest represents Christ during the Mass, and a woman cannot represent Christ. Why? Well, a woman can be as full of compassion as Jesus was, according to the Bible. She can be as wise, as kind, as loving. She can have all the virtues of Jesus, but she lacks one essential quality. She does not have a willy. That is what is most important about Jesus. Non-Catholics don't realize this. The most important fact about Jesus is that he had a willy. That's why only a man can symbolize Jesus during the Mass. Now, this is part of the ancient Mediterranean fertility cult. All over the Mediterranean, it was believed that magic power resides in the willy, which is why if you look at a recent unexpurgated edition of ancient Mediterranean religious art, you will find the gods all have 3 times as much willy as the average man has. These are known as ithyphallic statues. Dionysus looks like a bureau if you pull the middle drawer all the way out. Pan is Osiris. Well, Osiris, when they carried him through the streets to dramatize his resurrection, his erection reached the 3rd floor of the buildings. The idea is the bigger the willy, the greater the magical power indwelling. Now, since Catholics are very much into cannibalism, a taste which they share with Hannibal Lecter and a few others, you know what the judge said in sentencing Alfred Packer? Alfred Packer was the most famous cannibal in Colorado history. He and 11 others got trapped in a cabin during a terrible snowstorm, and they were stuck for the whole winter without food. When the spring thaw came, Alfred Packer came out alone, and there were some bones. He was put on trial, and his claim was they drew straws and ate each other one at a time, depending on who got the short straw. The prosecution argued that he murdered everybody else and ate them one by one. The case is still being debated among historians and archaeologists. Very ambiguous evidence. Anyway, on sentencing Packer to death, the judge said, "I have no remorse or regret in setting capital punishment in a case like this. Alfred Packer, damn your soul, there are only 11 Democrats in this county, and you ate 6 of them." Well, anyway, besides Hannibal Lecter and Alfred Packer, there's a lot of other people who are into cannibalism. The Feast of the Holy Communion in Protestant churches, it's believed this is a symbolic ritual. In the Catholic Church, it's not supposed to be symbolical at all. The priest, because he possesses a willy and therefore has magic power, when he mutters the proper formula, the proper magical formula, the piece of bread turns into the body and blood. They always say body and blood. I don't know why cannibals like blood, I guess. It changes into the body and blood of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Praise Jesus, yeah. Praise Bob, too, while we're at it. So, praise Bob, thank you. So, we can only perform this miracle of turning the bread into the body and blood of Jesus if you possess a willy. So the Catholic Church is obviously based on the ancient Mediterranean idea that divinity resides in the willy, and the more willy, the more divinity. So obviously the secret about how they choose the Pope is very much like casting the lead in a porn movie. They all lay it on the table, and somebody comes along with a ruler and measures. And that's why the Pope feels he's infallible. He can look at any other man in the room with a different opinion and say, "You think you know something? I got a bigger dick than you." Fuck you! And so that's why they all feel infallible. And that's my theory about how the Eucharist works, how infallibility works, and the inner workings of the Catholic Church. It's all the ancient Mediterranean fertility cult still surviving, disguised as Christianity. Well, it seems to be 4 o'clock. Does everybody agree with that? Oh, good. You see, we're back in the meta model again. We're talking about statements that can be verified. I am beginning to feel drowsy, and so I think we will... Tomorrow I might give you 4 hours. Today you're only getting 3 hours. I hope I got you confused enough that you'll be ready tomorrow to try some really interesting alternative realities. And thank you for your attention.